Anyway, so this is the first one, Questioning Authority, Meanings of Power. And then within this series, here's what we're looking at. Tonight's, of course, The Will of the Stronger, where we're going to get into some definitions. Next week, how to do things with words, rhetoric, the ancient art of rhetoric, and how it's still being employed today and with new technology, but it's still the same old move toward power and using power. This is actually Brooke's title, because we wanted to talk about sex, gender, and power, and she said, how about gazing upon Medusa, which is perfect, because you know if you gaze upon Medusa, you're supposed to turn to stone. Do the Right Thing, Power and Ethnicity. Is that too old a reference? Okay, good. The Appetite for Immortality is a line from Don DeLillo's White Noise, and it's about power and technology. The Root of All Evil, Power and Money. Anybody know where that line's from? The Bible. Oh, excuse me. Siri would like to talk to me for some reason.
Okay. I found something on the web for what we're looking at tonight. Of course, the well is stronger verb definition next week. How to do things with words, rhetoric, the engine part of it still being played today with new technology, but it's still the same. Move toward power, and using power is actually Brooke's title because we wanted to talk about sex, gender, and power, and she said, how about Gates and about Medusa, which is perfect because you know who gaze upon a star. Take a look.
All right. That was weird, right?
Way to question authority.
That was weird. Okay. Okay. Always be closing, power and marketing. Distrust and desire, power and institutions. That's a line from Mark Twain. The practice of freedom. If any of you are educators, you might recognize this phrase from Paulo Freire, from a book called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And then a line from Walt Whitman, my own master, total and absolute power and the individual. So thank you for coming out. Let's get started. So The Will of the Stronger is the title tonight. That's a line from the Republic, Plato's Republic, except it isn't, as these things go. Here we go. It is attributed to Thrasymachus, one of Socrates' interlocutors, but he never really says that justice is the will of the stronger. But that's kind of the point of Thrasymachus. Let me say more about what I mean, and let me start by giving you the section from the Republic. So this is Socrates speaking, and they're having discussions, they're having dialogues. That's what Plato did. He wrote the dialogues down, sort of. And so the discussion is justice. And this is Socrates speaking. Several times, he says, in the course of the discussion, Thrasymachus had made an attempt to get the argument into his own hands. That's a nice job by the translator, right? To get the argument into his own hands. You ever do that? I do it all the time. Try to get the argument into my own hands. And had been put down by the rest of the company who wanted to hear the end. But when Polemarchus and I had done speaking and there was a pause, he could no longer hold his peace. Thrasymachus could no longer hold his peace, and gathering himself up, he came at us like a wild beast, seeking to devour us. Socrates the snowflake, I guess. We were quite panic-stricken at the sight of him. See, this is why we have to do rhetoric next week, because this is some fine rhetoric right here. He roared out to the whole company, "What folly, Socrates, has taken possession of you all, and why, silly billies, do you knock under to one another?" That's direct translation from the Greek, I think, is silly billies. I say that if you want to know what justice is, you should not only ask, but answer. He's got a point if you've ever read a Platonic or Socratic dialogue. And you should not seek honor to yourself from the refutation of an opponent, but have your own answer, which Socrates never does. Well, that's a bit strong. He gets to it, but he wrings it out of everybody else first. For there is many a one who can ask and cannot answer. And now I will not have you say that justice is duty or advantage or profit or gain or interest, for this sort of nonsense will not do for me. I must have clearness and accuracy. Sounds like Socrates, actually, but this is Thrasymachus. And then Socrates goes on, and he basically says to calm down. Thrasymachus replies, "How characteristic of Socrates." With a bitter laugh, he replied, "That's your ironical style." That's actually right. Socrates is the first ironist, but Thrasymachus is the only one who ever recognizes that and calls him on it, because Plato won't let him. But let's not get into the weeds yet. Did I not foresee, have I not already told you that whatever he was asked, he would refuse to answer and try irony or any other shuffle in order that he might avoid answering? Listen, Thrasymachus says, I proclaim that justice is nothing else than the interest of the stronger. And now, why do you not praise me? Because of course you won't. Really interesting dialogue. Now, you need a moment? Okay. Well, Thrasymachus has himself, oh, I see what you're laughing at. Okay, sorry. I'm in the words, you're in the image, okay. I think it's a good image I actually spend a lot of time on the images, so thank you for laughing. I'm like, why is Thrasymachus funny? But okay. So I actually think Thrasymachus becomes a semiotic event here. He becomes a sign. I don't think that it's obvious. Whenever Alfred North Whitehead was famous for saying that all of Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato. And so he's not wrong. Everybody's playing off of Plato, repeating Plato, building upon Plato. But Thrasymachus represents those who do not. Thrasymachus represents the departure from the Platonic truth, or really the Platonic search for truth. So again, it's not clear what's being said in the dialogue, except that Thrasymachus is rejecting Socrates, not only his conclusion, but his method, which is really important. And so it's interesting, because I think this is the first thing we should learn about power, is that when power is taken, and it must be taken, right? Because to give power doesn't really mean anything. Isn't that an act of power, to give power? So let's say when power is taken, it always feels like the world is lost to those from whom it is being taken. Again, I don't know if this is relevant today, but I hope so. Well, you've had probably the conversations that I've had about the Me Too movement, especially with guys, where they're like, what are we going to do? Really? We're going to not do stupid shit. That's really all this is about. But it doesn't feel that way. It feels like something huge, something significance being lost. And so Thrasymachus becomes that, because Plato, Socrates in particular, but especially Plato, become a sign themselves of the search and the acquisition of absolute truth. And so if you go against Socrates, you must be a nihilist, right? And you must not believe anything. Or worse, you must believe that the gods don't exist and truth doesn't exist. So it's these huge categories, right? That's one of the things that power can do, especially in language, is create these huge categories. So if you're not in this category, you're automatically in this one. That happened, for example, with European contact with indigenous people on this continent, where Europeans, beginning with Columbus and following with many others, land on this continent and go, oh, Indian. And you know, the Apache or the Navajo and the Pueblo are looking at each other and they're like, we're ancient enemies. What are you talking about? We're not the same thing. We're not one Indian. It dampens and sometimes elides difference. And so you have one big category. Power works in big categories. It works through big categories. We'll see this especially when we get to the talk and discussion on institutions, where we invoke Michel Foucault. Hey there. All right, so Thrasymachus becomes the sign of the anti-truth, even though all he's doing is saying, I don't respect, I don't follow your method, Socrates. That's all he's doing. And so he gets cast by other philosophers. It's not just Plato and Socrates, it's other philosophers who do this too throughout Western history. Oh, I remember in the 80s there was this book called Situational Ethics. That was it's situational ethics. It was Joseph Fletcher, and he was like, you know, your ethics depends on your situation, which is kind of obviously true, but they were like, oh, Thrasymachus, you're Thrasymachus. You don't believe in absolute ethics. Well, I don't know anyone who believes in absolute ethics, or at least practices absolute ethics. So Thrasymachus becomes this catch-all term. He gets used to say that moral values are socially constructed and are nothing but the reflections of interest of particular communities. Well, aren't they? Because if they're not socially constructed, what are they? They're either natural, so you're going to make a biological, deterministic understanding of ethics? I don't think so. Maybe you can try. Or the alternative is a Platonic, theological, absolute ethics. So again, anytime you move away from the good, the true, and the beautiful as articulated by Plato, you're a Thrasymachus. Foreshadowing of Nietzsche, who we can't get into by any means, but basically Nietzsche, one of Nietzsche's famous phrases is, God is dead and we have killed him. What shall we do with this blood on our hands? So Nietzsche is about power. He's about the power of the individual. We'll actually get into Nietzsche in the last lecture. He's Machiavelli, right? The exercise of pure power over against any other values. And what happens here is really interesting because it's like hedonism, right? Which actually happened in ancient Greek thought is hedonism, the Greek word for pleasure, hedon. I want to pursue pleasure. Okay, except you're a human being, so it's not just about pursuing pleasure, it's also about avoiding pain. Okay, yeah, that's how I want to live my life. So you go out and you drink a bottle of Jameson's. That was pleasurable until the pain comes, right? And so if you're a true hedonist, you're going to balance that out, right? Because your goal is to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. This is the same thing. If you believe that the exercise of power is the primary motivation for the prince, as Machiavelli did, you're not just going to go around blowing away people, because that's going to complicate your life, right? You can't exercise power without thinking, without a philosophy, without a sense of some of the other stuff coming in, and that's Machiavelli. All right, so The biggest thing is Socrates' method of elenchus, this sense of questioning. And again, if you've ever read one of Plato's dialogues where Socrates is the main character, it's good, but it's also maddening because it's just this questioning. Socrates will say, hey, what do you think about justice? And somebody will say, well, it's obviously this. Is it? Socrates, do you really? But what about, and then it's just what Thrasymachus says. It's the best critique of Socrates in existence, and that's why he gets plowed over in later discussions and becomes a sign of everything that is not truth. Okay, power is the only virtue in this sign. As you might guess, it's a little more complicated than that. So, let's zoom out now from Thrasymachus and try to understand power through some definitions and then through a particular book on power that I think is especially helpful. So, from the New Oxford American Dictionary, power is the ability. You are able. Simple ability. And notice how this definition progresses. The simple ability to do something or act in a particular way, especially as a faculty or quality. The power of speech, his powers of concentration. All right? Poer, Middle English, from the Anglo-Norman French poer, which I'm probably mangling. You know where that goes to, ultimately? The Greek word poesis, or poetes, which means poet. The etymology of the word poet is that of power. And so poets have, in many societies, maybe even most societies, been seen as truth tellers. And we mean this not in the highly refined sense of, a poet who wrote 14 books of poetry, although it includes that. We mean the sense of a storyteller, a user of language who confronts power with power. It's good to keep that in mind. Then it goes to the capacity to act upon the external world and yourself, right? So now we're getting into a more common, I guess, sense of power, or probably the sense of power that brought you here tonight. The capacity to act upon the external world, including oneself, and then ultimately mastery, right? So not just ability, not just capacity, but mastery, right? I think that's the sense of power that many of us are walking around with, thinking about, and maybe came here tonight to talk about. Some interesting definitions. Thomas Hobbes, author of Leviathan, who you may remember, we had a class on it, says that the state of nature is nasty, brutish, what does he say? Nasty, brutish, something in short. Life is nasty, brutish, and short. And therefore, you need a state to control everybody. You need the state. And so you must subsume the present means to a larger future good. And the only way to do that is through the state, according to Thomas Hobbes. This is Ralph Waldo Emerson, who has an interesting essay on power. He has a lot of interesting essays. He says this: life is a search after power. This is an element with which the world is so saturated, there is no chink or crevice in which it is not lodged, that no honest seeking goes unrewarded. And that's kind of the motto for our series. The world is so saturated with power that no honest seeking goes unrewarded. All successful women have agreed in one thing, that they were causationists. Causationists. They believed in causes. You don't have to believe in causes. David Hume would tell you that there's no evidence that there's causality in the world. But let's not get into that. Emerson says all powerful people are causationists. They believe that X leads to Y leads to Z. And moreover, well, I should let him say it, They believed that things went not by luck but by law, that there was not a weak or cracked link in the change that joins the first and last of things. A belief in causality or strict connection between every trifle and the principle of being, and in consequence, belief in compensation or that nothing is got for nothing, characterizes all valuable minds and must control every effort that is made by an industrious one. The most valiant women are the best believers in the tension of the laws. Bertrand Russell, power is the production of intended effects. So it's not blindly exercising your power. You do it with an aim, a goal, an intentionality. Dennis Wrong, who has a great name, sociologist, power is the capacity of some persons to produce intended and foreseen effects on others. So here we are, right? This is it. It's about our power in relation to each other. In fact, the relationship really goes one way. One person has power over another to produce intended and foreseen effects. That's what the series is about. Whoa, this is going to be amazing. So the one philosopher that has written on power, it's interesting. It's like Emerson's point. Power is so imbued into everything that we do. It's hard to pull the thread out and analyze it. And so a few people have, and it's mostly sociologists, and that's great, and we'll engage some of those, but and some political scientists, and that's great, and we'll engage some of those, but more interested in the philosophy, I'm more interested in a cultural approach to power for our series. So that's what we're going to be doing. And that's why you'll see that next week is about language, and after that is like these cultural categories of sex and gender, and et cetera. So let's take Bertrand Russell's, in the remainder of our time, let's take Bertrand Russell's book titled Simply Power, and let's work through some of the things he says about it, because it's a great place to start a series on power, because he lays out the issues very nicely with some definitions. So he says power in sociology is analogous to energy in physics, right? So that's this nature of this study. It's very difficult to study energy in physics, I'm told, not that I would know, but you see the point. You're trying to study a force. You can't isolate the thing so much, especially as Heisenberg noticed. It's so imbued in everything that it's hard to analyze, and so maybe traditional methods are not going to work. Bertrand Russell says this: there are many ways in which different societies differ in relation to power. They differ to begin with in the degree of power possessed by individuals and organizations. And we're going to come up against this over and over. The individual and the institution. Individual and culture is a way we live and experience power. And institutions and their power are some of the major forces. I was going to say arrayed against us. They are arrayed against us, but they also exist for us, and we'll get into all that. They differ again, societies, as regards the kind of organization that is most influential. So he says sometimes a military despotism, a theocracy, a plutocracy are very dissimilar types, but they all exercise this kind of power, the second kind, the influence of the organization. Thirdly, through diversity in the ways of acquiring power, hereditary kingship produces one kind of eminent person. The qualities required of a great ecclesiastic produce another kind. Democracy produces a third kind, war a fourth. Okay, societies in power. Now, here we get kind of Hobbesian, as we would say. This is going back to Hobbes a little bit. And this is what he called the state of nature. And Hobbes' Leviathan is an attempt to solve the state of nature, because the state of nature is a problem, because nasty, brutish, and short, right? So we need something to intervene, according to Hobbes. Russell says where no social institution such as aristocracy or hereditary monarchy exists to limit the number of people to whom power is possible. Those who most desire power, you know where he's going, right, are, broadly speaking, those most likely to acquire it, right? It follows that, he continues, in a social system in which power is open to all, the posts which confer power will, as a rule, be occupied by the men who differ from the average in being exceptionally power-loving. That's right, isn't it? In a so-called democracy where power is available theoretically, in principle, to everyone, that means if you want power, you will seek it. Actually, we're going to get into this in more detail, so I don't want to go into too much here. But that rings true, doesn't it? Is that people have power, many people, most people have power because they want it, and so they get it, right? And in the process, they make exchanges along the way. Well, first of all, he says, Russell says, the love of power is unevenly distributed, okay, and is limited by various other motives. So this gets to your question, Edie, your point, other motives, because we may love power, but we also love other things. We love ease. Frankly, that's why I'm not very powerful. It's too exhausting to be powerful. Maybe you're in touch with that emotion too. And it is. I mean, you've met people who are like, you know, and they get power, and they're like, good. I'm like, wow, not worth it, dude. Love of pleasure. Hey, power's great, but pleasure's even greater. Word. Sometimes love of approval. Yeah, this is right, isn't it? I mean, we have competing loves, competing desires, love of ease, love of pleasure, sometimes love of approval. Our love of power is disguised among the more timid, Russell says, as an impulse of submission to leadership. Now we're getting into it, right? So I'm going to say, I just, whatever you say, I'll follow you. That's a power move, right? Russell is saying, which increases the scope of power impulses of bold women. Those whose love of power is not strong are unlikely to have much influence on the course of events. Let that hang there a second. Those whose love of power is not strong are unlikely to have much influence on the course of events. The men who cause social changes are, as a rule, men who strongly desire to do so. Love of power, therefore, is characteristic of the men who are causally important, who do things, who make things happen. By the way, if you're wondering, I'm trying to help Bertrand Russell with his gender pronouns. So this is a fascinating exercise, by the way, because we've always been told that man and mankind, that's a non-gendered term. Just try not using it. It's not a non-gendered term. It's really interesting. Change. But Russell again, we should of course be mistaken if we regarded it as the sole human motive, our desire for power, but this mistake would not lead us so much astray as might be expected in the search for causal laws in social science, since love of power is the chief motive producing the changes which social science has to study. Okay, I think you already know where he's going next, but let me just lay it out here, leaders and followers, right? The power impulse, he continues, and notice what he's doing. He's starting up here very generally, he's being deductive. He's starting up here very generally, and he's moving down into very specific arguments and experiences and phenomena of power. Russell again, quoting, the power impulse has two forms, explicit in leaders, implicit in followers. When women willingly follow a leader, they do so with a view to the acquisition of power by the group which she commands, and they feel that her triumphs are theirs. Most women do not feel in themselves the competence required for leading their group to victory, and therefore seek out a captain who appears to possess the courage and sagacity necessary for the achievement of supremacy. Why do we follow people? And we all follow people. We all do something that somebody says to us, even if that person is a representative of a larger institution with that institutional force behind her, but we do it. Like, well, forgive me, but why are we still paying taxes? I'm ready. If you all want to stop paying taxes, I'm with you. Right? I'm saying shut it all down. Just shut it down. And then we'll start paying taxes back when we get what we want in the form of government. I'm just saying, but I'm not going to do that. Because I'm a follower, and I don't want to deal with, the IRS people who are representing people who can take everything I have. It was good for a moment, though. Although I still believe that. I still believe if we could all just get together and say, look, we don't like this, the majority of us, which we clearly don't, no more money. It is this, I'll let Bertrand Russell talk, sorry. It is this that makes endurable the inequalities of power, which organization makes inevitable. Have you not felt this? We are not, most of us are willing to trade the inequalities of power for the organization that it affords. And I hate to use this as an example, but it was the case in early 20th century Germany that, I don't know if the trains ran on time, but what enabled the Nazis to do what they did was their unforeseen, unheard of to that point organization, their bureaucracy, if you will. That's what enabled them to exterminate 6 million people.
And propaganda.
Well, doing things with words next week. Yep. Inequality. Most collective enterprises are only possible if they are directed by some governing body. Continuing with Russell, but the fact that this is possible, and still more the fact that the actual inequalities of power exceed what is necessary by technical causes. Okay, so sure, there's going to be some inequality whenever you try to do things as a group. Russell's point is that we go beyond that, and we do, right? So seeing the inequality, it's almost like the powerful seize upon it and extend it and exacerbate it and use more of it, garner it. This can only be explained. Why this happens can only be explained in terms of individual psychology and physiology. I disagree with you, Dr. Russell. I think it's explained by culture, but okay. Individual psychology and physiology. Some men's characters lead them always to command, others always to obey. True?
Yes.
Really? Okay. I didn't think that'd go over well, but all right. Between these extremes lie the mass of average human beings. Congratulations, average human beings, who like to command in some situations, but in others prefer to be subject to a leader. We are submissive. Mortimer Adler, in his book Understanding Human Nature, says there's always a submissive type and an imperious type. And if you're like me, you're probably weary of such classifications. Okay, good, me too. Which is a power move to make such classifications, of course. The servile individual, he says, lives by the rules and laws of others, and this type seeks out a servile position. I'm not even going to read this because I think we're beyond it, so never mind. Here's what I think we're not beyond. This is, again, Adler, a great philosopher and writer. The greatest disadvantage of an authoritative education, Adler says, lies in the fact that it gives the child an ideal of power and shows to the child the pleasures which are connected with the possession of power. I think that's right. I think what we're teaching children is power, because we put them in what is functionally like a prison, and we exercise our power over them. And it's always going to be for noble goals. This is where Foucault's going to come in. What happens is the exercise of power and the sites, according to Foucault, of power. Anyway, that's coming up. Authoritative education, Russell says, produces the slave type as well as the despotic type, since it leads to the feeling that the only possible relation between two human beings who cooperate is that in which one issues orders and the other obeys them. Now, for what it's worth, I think we've gotten better at this. When I went to school, this was pretty much it. When my older sister went to school, this was absolutely it. My wife teaches TK through 6, and I think the kids have all the power, frankly. She can't do anything. She can't even manage the classroom because she's got 30 first graders who just take over. I love this, those who withdraw. Here we go. Now we're going to get to the type of people, and again, I hate that type of people, but I'm quoting, in relation to power who withdraw. Russell. I have spoken hitherto of those who command and those who obey, but there's a third type. Oh, that's me. Namely, those who withdraw. There are women who have the courage to refuse submission without having the imperiousness that causes the wish to command. Such women do not fit readily into the social structure, and in one way or another they seek a refuge where they can enjoy a more or less solitary freedom. At times, women with this temperament have been of great historical importance, the early Christians and the American pioneers. Sometimes the refuge is mental. Sometimes the refuge is mental. Sometimes physical. Sometimes it demands the complete solitude of a hermitage, Brahmavid. Sometimes the social solitude of a monastery. Among the mental refugees are those who belong to obscure sects, those whose interests are absorbed by innocent fads, and those who occupy themselves with recondite and unimportant forms of erudition. I think he's talking about Facebook in 1910. Of those who withdraw, some are not genuinely indifferent to power, but attain it by unusual methods. Such men may become saints or heresiarchs, founders of monastic orders or new schools in art and literature. They attach themselves as disciples to people who combine a love of submission with the impulse to revolt. Now you're talking. Because it's both, right? That's what's wrong with categorization, is that they never hold. I have a love of submission because of these other competing desires, but I also have an impulse to revolt. The latter prevents orthodoxy, while the former leads to uncritical adoption of new tenets. The genuine solitary is unique. For men of this temperament, the solitary one who withdraws, the world affords fewer and fewer opportunities. Some drift into crime. Some into a morose and antisocial philosophy. Don't worry, Donnie, these men are cowards. Thank you for getting it. Too much contact with their fellow men produces misanthropy. When solitude is unattainable, turns naturally toward violence. Okay, so he goes on to say, I'm not going to quote him here, he goes on to say that what this produces is a sense of community, a community kind of outside power, although you can never be outside power, but it's a community ideologically, even spiritually, philosophically set against the forces of power. Maybe that's us here. I don't know. We can see. But the third thing, right? It's always the third thing. It's these types and these types, and then the third thing, who embodies both but transcends both. There's a I wanted to include this because I don't know if you remember a book, it seems like ages ago, called What's the Matter with Kansas by Thomas Frank. You ever heard of this? I think it was early 2000s, maybe, I don't know. Anyway, he's a political scientist. He's like, why do people in Kansas vote for conservatives when it's clearly not in their interest to do so? And I don't think I'm being political by saying that. If you look at the Kansas budget and what happened in the state of Kansas, what happened with that governor they elected, the indices are all bad, right? But they voted against their interests. And there's a sociologist named Charles Tilley who came up with these 7 reasons they do so. And so he says, what do we do about the fact that people vote, not just vote, but they act against their clear interests, right? He says 7 things. The premise is incorrect. Subordinates, or Russell would say submissives, are actually rebelling continuously, but in covert ways. That sounds right to me. Subordinates, submissives, actually get something in return for their subordination, something that is sufficient to make them acquiesce most of the time. Kind of covered that. Through the pursuit of other valued ends, such as esteem or identity, subordinates become implicated in systems that exploit or oppress them, right? So pay your taxes. As a result of mystification, repression, or sheer unavailability of alternative ideological frames, submissives remain unaware of their true interests. And that one, number 4, is part of the mission of this school, is to make you aware. Make you aware of your true interests, which is to give to the University of Philosophical Research. The other thing he says, number 5, is that force and inertia just keep this in place. I know I'm from the South, and the reason my people are still my people and have been for generations is just, I don't think it's a political position, I don't think it's a philosophical position, it's just, this is what our parents did, this is what their parents did, and you keep doing it. Resistance 6, resistance and rebellion are costly, and most submissives or subordinates lack the necessary means for resistance and rebellion. And number 7 is all of the above. Nice. All right, moving on. Forms of power. There is law, there's traditional power, there's naked power, and revolutionary power. Traditional power, I think you know. Naked power is brute force, so like a military coup. And then revolutionary power, he says, is like a revolutionary coup with an ideology behind it other than we want the power. So the American Revolution would be an example of that, revolutionary power. He says there are philosophers of power, and I'm not going into this because I think we'll touch on some of these already, and I think you can live your life without hearing about Johann Fichte and some of these people, or Henri Bergson. We'll hear about Nietzsche later. Okay, so there's Leviathan, by the way, that I kept talking about. So I tried to sit down. One of the fun things about doing these for you is, first of all, gathering the art, because it's so fun. We have such weird topics. So, just Google the philosophy of power and then do an art history search. It's fascinating. And I'm kind of teaching myself art history along the way. You do the same with literature, and I'm like, I just gave up. I'm like, every book ever written is about power. But here are some. Some you might not know, or one you might not know is, a couple. Apuleius the Golden Ass. If you've been here a while, you've heard me talk about the Golden Ass, about a man who turns into an ass because he's messing around with power that he doesn't know about. He sees, I'm going to tell this story because it's such a good story. He's just a guy. He's a guy, and he has a girl. And they're hanging around, and they see a witch. And she makes something into a bird and makes it fly. He's like, man, I wish I could do that. And she's like, well, let me see. I think I can do it. Right? You don't do that. And so she tries it because all she's doing is following what she saw, right? She turns him into an ass, like a donkey, like an ass. And the whole book is him, this happens like in the first chapter. The whole book is him wandering around as an ass. And so I gave a lecture, I think it was this is 2019. What year is this? 2017, I gave a lecture called How Not to Be an Ass. And one of the things you have to do is you have to keep moving. Anyway, he ends up, in the end, becoming a priest of Isis because he kept moving. And he finally was no longer an ass. So Apuleius, the golden ass. By the way, you probably know the story of Cupid and Psyche. That finds its fullest expression in that book, one of the first novels ever. And then Linda Hogan's book, Native American woman named Power. And then I thought, well, power in film. And I'm like, well, okay, that's every film. And then I slowed down a little bit and tried to think of it, and two things came to mind which I want to share with you.
Stay away from him.
Just lay down, Luke. He's just gonna knock you down again, buddy.
Not your fault. He's just too big. So let him hit you in the nose and get some blood flowing.
Yeah.
Maybe the bosses will stop it before he kills you.
I don't want to frighten him.
Stay down, Luke. That's the end of it. Come on. Go get up.
Stay down, Luke. He's gonna kill you. Stay down.
Somebody ought to stop this thing.
Stay down. You're beat.
You're gonna have to kill me.
if you know the film, you know that this is where Luke, who is new to the prison here in South Georgia, gets his nickname, Cool Hand, because I forget the character's name, George Kennedy's character. Drago? Thank you, Mario. He says, he goes back, and he's obviously the biggest, most powerful guy there, and so he's got to establish his power with Luke. And Luke comes back, and they go back in, and he says, "You kept coming back at me with nothing." And Luke says, "Sometimes nothing's a pretty cool hand." Amazing scene, right? The absolute shifting of power in 4 minutes just because he won't stay down. So he lost, but he won. And then, of course,
why have you come back?
Please, sir, we've done what you told us. We brought you the broomstick of the Wicked Witch of the West. We melted her.
Oh, you liquidated her, eh? Very resourceful.
Yes, sir. So we'd like you to keep your promise to us, if you please, sir.
Not so fast! Not so fast! I'll have to give the matter a little thought. Go away and come back tomorrow.
Tomorrow? Oh, but I want to go home now.
You've had plenty of time already.
Yeah. Do not arouse the wrath of the great and powerful Oz. I said come back tomorrow.
If you were really great and powerful, you'd keep your promises.
Do you presume to criticize the great Oz? You ungrateful creatures think yourselves lucky that I'm giving you audience tomorrow instead of 20 years from now. Oh, the great Oz has spoken. Oh, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. The great Oz has spoken.
Who are you?
Oh, I am the great and powerful Wizard of Oz.
You are? I don't believe you.
No, I'm afraid it's true. There's no other wizard except me. You humbug! Yes, it's exactly so. I'm a humbug.
Oh, you're a very bad man.
Oh, no, my dear. I'm a very good man. I'm just a very bad wizard.
honestly, we could spend the next 10 weeks just doing those two scenes, I think. Seriously. I mean, maybe we'll refer back to them. But just to end, a few, again, because power is so woven into our culture, here are just a few quotations that might help us define it for tonight. Frederick Douglass, who I'm here is doing really well. That's what the president said a while ago, that he was doing great. Born in 18, whatever. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Gandhi, power is of two kinds. One is obtained by the fear of punishment, the other by acts of love. Power based on love is 1,000 times more effective and permanent than the one derived from fear or punishment, of punishment. Dostoevsky, power is given only to him who dares to stoop and take it. One must have the courage to dare. Ursula Le Guin, we live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art, and very often in our art, the art of words. I don't know if you know this book by Tobias Wolff, This Boy's Life. It's a great book. Fearlessness in those without power is maddening to those who have it. Tolstoy, what is the cause of historical events? Power. What is power? Power is the sum total of wills transferred to one person. On what condition are the wills of the masses transferred to one person? On condition that the person express the will of the whole people. That is, power is power. That is, power is a word, the meaning of which we do not understand. And then you may remember this from 1984. Now I will tell you I'll tell you the answer to my question. It is this: the party seeks power entirely for its own sake. We're not interested in the good of others. We're only interested solely in power, pure power. What pure power means to you, you will understand presently, Winston. He's talking to Winston. We are different from the oligarchies of the past in that we know what we are doing. All the others, even those who resembled ourselves, were cowards and hypocrites. The German Nazis and the Russian communists came very close in their methods, but they never had the courage to recognize their own motives. They pretended, perhaps even believed, that they had seized power unwillingly and for a limited time, and just around the corner there lay a paradise where human beings would be free and equal. We are not like that. We know that no one ever seizes power with the intention of relinquishing it. Power is not a means, it is an end. One does not establish a dictatorship in order to safeguard a revolution. One mistakes the revolution. One makes the revolution in order to establish the dictatorship. The object of persecution is persecution. The object of torture is torture. The object of power is power. Now you begin to understand me. And I'm not going to end on that, don't worry. Michel Foucault, from The History of Sexuality, who I've been referencing, where there is power, there is resistance. And then this finally from Margaret Atwood, The Handmaid's Tale. I'm glad the series is out and doing well, but the book is amazing. And this is the narrator, Offred, of Fred, because we don't know her name. She is of Fred. And anyway, I don't want to tell you the whole story, but basically this is her voice about being subject, a complete subject. She is forced to have sex with a powerful man in the presence of that powerful man's wife in order to continue the human species. So is the line. She says this, and I think it's one of the most amazing quotations on power out there. But remember that forgiveness, too, is a power. To beg for it is a power, and to withhold or bestow it is a power, perhaps the greatest. Maybe none of this whole subjugation, this whole Republic of Gilead in the novel, maybe none of this is about control. Maybe it isn't really about who can own whom, who can do what to whom and get away with it, even as far as death. Maybe it isn't about who can sit and who has to kneel or stand or lie down, legs spread open. Maybe it's about who can do what to whom and be forgiven for it. Never tell me it amounts to the same thing. Thank you. I'm sure you have questions.